Hello again. Welcome back to the Money Corner. Tonight is a very important show for me, and I hope it'll be a very important show for you. My guest is Chris Sullivan. Chris is a colleague of mine at Merrill Lynch. Chris is an executive with Merrill Lynch. He commands a great deal of respect in our firm. Chris also is one of our executives who has a handicap. He is hearing impaired. Chris is deaf. Chris is very verbal, as you'll hear in a few minutes. He's very articulate. But we have a purpose in being with you tonight. I do work for Merrill Lynch, and while I work there, I try not to be overly commercial. The chairman of our company is a man named Bill Schreier. Bill is a very feeling person and is very concerned about our involvement in the community. And Bill has been spearheading a program to get our firm more deeply involved in working with the handicap community. Working with handicap community, having people like Chris work with our firm in executive positions, in staff positions, in ordinary jobs. But also, Bill has been concerned about increasing our ability to not only communicate to the handicapped or the deaf community, but also to help them become active investors. And by the way, many of them already are active investors and doing very well as investors. Tonight, Chris is going to talk to you and give you some background on the hard of hearing or the deaf population, some characteristics, and tell you a little about how they function. And also, we'll try to illustrate to you how we will communicate out to the deaf community. There's one other purpose in the show tonight. It may very well be that you have a friend or relative, a loved one, who now is a member of the deaf community, the hard of hearing community. And in that case, we hope that you will tell him about the show, tell him or her about the show, and encourage them to look at a future show, or encourage them to call me at the Paramus office, or help put me in touch with them so that we can start getting our literature out to them. The purpose of this show really is to show that community what we have in way of information, which will make them more active in the general community and hopefully will make them more affluent. So with that, by way of introduction, let me introduce Chris Sullivan. Chris, thank you for coming to the studio tonight and being on the Money Corner. Chris, you've been with Merrill Lynch now for several years.
That's right.
How long is it, Chris?
How long?
Have you worked for Merrill Lynch?
I've worked since 1987.
Now, Chris was not always in his present job. Prior to doing this, he had worked in our market research department. He was a technical analyst, and he would help brokers spot trends in stocks, spot trends in the general market, and he was a very, very competent man as a technical analyst. However, how long have you been in the new job now, Chris?
2 years. I was basically a personal assistant to our firm.
I know that.
Yes. And so it was a wonderful opportunity for me as a deaf person to work that barrier. I have to be the first deaf analyst on Wall Street, not only for the company itself, but for Wall Street in general.
Well, many people have told me, you may be the first deaf analyst, but we have many analysts on Wall Street who can't really see.
True. Yeah.
Now, Chris does communicate very well, and Chris communicates in a dual fashion. First, he has a very effective hearing device, which, by the way, thanks to technology, has becoming smaller and smaller. At the beginning of the program, Chris pointed out to me that as a child, his battery operation was a box, looked like the size of 2 soda cans. Now it's down, it's miniaturized to just little dots. And also, Chris is a very fluid lip reader and carries on a conversation as you and I would. Chris, tell us a little about the deaf population, size, how they function, where they function, and a little about them.
Sure, I'll be glad to. Right now in this country we have about 23 million hearing impaired
23
people.
million.
Yes. And of that number, about 4 to 5 million people are profoundly deaf. And about
Profoundly deaf, Chris, would be non-hearing totally.
That's right.
And probably sign to communicate.
A large number of them will sign.
Yeah, Chris, my assumption is you sign frequently with some of the people in the deaf community.
Oh, absolutely. I sign very frequently myself. I started learning how to sign only recently, about 4 or 5 years ago. I grew up what is called an oralist. In other words, a deaf person who learns how to speak. until about 5 years ago when I met my wife, who's a very strong believer in sign language. I became attracted to it, and now I'm sort of like bilingual, being able to talk and sign almost at the same time.
How old were you when you started to speak? Did you start to speak?
Well, I took speech lessons shortly after my hearing loss was discovered at the age of 1. So I had a very, very intense speech training.
You didn't have speech training as an infant or as a toddler, did you? Your speech training began at age when?
Yes.
What age?
Well, I actually really began when I went to nursery school at the age of 3 or 4.
I see.
Yeah. At that time, speech training was kind of medieval. They didn't really have a very, very sophisticated technique that we have nowadays. But I give them credit for what they've done so far.
Well, you're very verbal,
yes.
and I understand you very well.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Well, getting back to the hearing impaired market, there are about 15, 16 million hard of hearing people. And those are people who have slight to mild hearing loss. And the deaf hearing impaired market itself has a large number of different groups. We have the signing deaf. We also have the Asian deaf population.
Oh, now wait, let me just emphasize this for the audience. We have the signing deaf.
Signing deaf.
We have the aging deaf.
Asian deaf.
So those are people whose hearing impairment may come on in midlife.
In midlife, right. In fact, according to the statistical studies done by the government researchers, over 30% of all the people over age 55 will have some degree of hearing loss.
Really?
Yes. So it shows that the numbers will grow more as we go into the
well, the demographics
century.
now, we're getting an increasing, we have a big expansion in the senior population.
Exactly. As the baby boomers grow older, become grayer, those are the people who will start have the need for special technical devices such as TDDs, hearing aids, speech amplifiers, decoders for the television in order to get closed caption, and many other uses.
Yeah, excuse me a minute, Chris.
Sure.
During the second part of the program, after the announcement, we'll demonstrate one of the technical devices that enable the non-hearing or the deaf person to communicate with the general population. Just to repeat that, Chris, some of the technical assists are the TDY.
One is TDY, that's really a short term for teletypewriters.
Teletypewriter.
Right. TDD stands for telecommunication device for the
telecommunication device.
That's correct.
Uh-huh.
We also have decoders, which allows one to get special closed caption frequency for the television, and also from the video cassette.
I see.
If you look at the video cassette, you will find a special symbol, starts with a CC or a TV box, and those are reflective of the capability of having a closed caption.
Well, do all TV sets have the capability of bringing in programs with a decoding device?
Yes, major TV networks now provide closed caption for most of the primetime shows.
Just remind me, Chris, the number of total non-hearing people in the population is how many?
22 million.
22 million. So more and more, those people are in the general community as they have the ability to understand through the decoders and hear what is happening in the total world.
In total world, the percentage of hearing impaired people in the United States is 9%.
9% of the population.
I will use that same percentage number in other countries as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chris, how do you see, and how will we in Merrill Lynch be working with the non-hearing population?
Well, that's precisely why the program was set up. When I became an analyst on Wall Street, a number of hearing impaired professionals would come to me for financial advice. And since I don't have a license, a Series 7 license, that's required of all financial consultants before they can disseminate information to the public, I will refer those prospective clients to the FCs were equipped with TDDs.
Let me clarify that for the audience. In order for a stockbroker or a financial consultant to give financial advice, particularly on securities that are traded on one of the exchanges, he or she must pass a Series 7 exam, which is a very, very difficult exam now. It's given very often. It requires a lot of study. There are many people in Wall Street who may not necessarily have a Series 7 license because they work in areas where they don't communicate directly with the public. And Chris was in that position. Chris was in a staff position where he provided technical guidance to brokers about investing, but he was prohibited from communicating with the general public.
That's correct. That's correct. So I refer those people to a hearing impaired financial consultant in Maryland.
In Maryland?
In Maryland, right.
We had one hearing impaired financial consultant?
That's right, in the whole Maryland's complex.
And by the way, at some point, we had close to 10,000 brokers.
That's correct, yeah. So it occurred to me at that point that Maryland could be able to provide communication accessibility to deaf people anywhere in the country. So I made this proposal to Maryland that we should have a program in effect for that service. And so they accepted my idea of this proposal, and I became manager of this program of September last year.
Chris, the person in Maryland, did he service both hearing and non-hearing people, or was his clientele mainly hearing impaired?
The clients in my market are mainly hearing impaired.
No, I mean
the FC
in Maryland. I'm curious about.
Oh, in Maryland, he's primarily focused on the deaf because he's deaf himself. He has over 500 hearing impaired accounts.
Really? Oh, is he still in production? He's still with us.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah. He has clients from all over the country. He's registered in almost 38 states.
Really?
Yes. Yeah.
Now he communicates with his people through
the TDD.
The TDD. And we're going to show you the TDD in just a moment.
Yes. And in addition to Steve Lobach, the Maryland FC that I mentioned about, I have 69 other FCs in my network, and they're all hearing. But I have some connection to the deaf community by way of having deaf parents or deaf children or being in their own previous profession. So a lot of those FCs in fact have some sensitivity toward the
Okay, I want to recapitulate because we're going to pause for an announcement in a moment. There are now, in addition to Steve Lobeck in Maryland, who is totally non-hearing, we have 69 other FCs or financial consultants in Merrill Lynch who work with some segment of the non-hearing population.
Right.
We're going to pause for just a moment for an announcement, and we'll be back. When we come back, we'll show you one of the technical devices that the people who work with Chris use to communicate with the non-hearing population. So stay with us. We'll be back with you in just a moment. Thank you for staying with us. Welcome back again in the Money Corner. My guest, unless you weren't with us in the first segment, or as you may know, is Chris Sullivan. Chris is an executive at Merrill Lynch, and Chris is in charge of our special program for the handicapped, particularly the hearing impaired and the hard of hearing. Chris, you gave us some of the some facts about the general population, the non-hearing population, but tell us a little now about the technology and the instruments that the hearing impaired or the hard of hearing use to communicate and stay in touch with the hearing world or the speaking world.
Yes. This particular technology came into focus about 10 years ago. It really started out with the old Western Union teletypewriter machine, the 300, 400 pounders. And when they were cast off to be replaced by more sophisticated equipment, the deaf community took them back from the junkyard and set up a network in communicating with each other, and which stretched across from coast to coast. But with the advancement of the computer chips, we came down with this particular box we have on the table, and we have about, in this country, over 400,000 TDDs. And it required two people with similar equipment to communicate with each other. And the cost range between $200 to $500
depending on the option you want. If you want auto answer printer, then it will be a little more expensive, mainly in the $400 range. This particular model or piece of equipment, it really helps to bridge the gap between the deaf and the hearing world.
Now, this model is set up with an electric cord, and we've got it connected to an extension in the studio, but it also can be battery operated and portable.
That's correct, for about a few hours.
If you want to turn it on, then I hit this little switch here, as you told me before, and that turns it on, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
And I hope our our television audience can see that. Digits are coming out now in the little screen. Let me see if I can read it with my glasses.
Right. It's a hi, Phil.
I'm sight
how
impaired.
Are you? In GI, meaning go ahead.
Okay.
It tells the other party to respond back to me.
Right. Hi, Phil. How are you? Okay.
GI.
How are you? Oh, GA.
Right. Means go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Now, in turn, I might type something back. So if I got on there, could I just start typing it? Would my message start coming across?
Hi, Chris.
Well, how about letting me do it? I'm a self-learner or something.
You can type an abbreviated form.
Hi, Chris, C-H-R-I-S. Oh, and my message is now going back to your machine.
And GI.
Okay, okay. Now, my understanding, Chris, is that each machine can have a little printer on it.
It can. Most of your TDDs have printers on it because it helps the deaf people review our conversation and keep
have
a
record
and so forth. Right.
So one can, in communicating, one can read the message as it's coming across, or one can read the tape that comes out,
either way.
Much like a calculating machine.
Exactly.
The same type of printer. Now, what about the telephone here? What is the function of that?
This particular telephone has a spatial amplification device.
Yes.
Which helps the hard of hearing people to communicate without the use of a TDD.
So on this telephone, then there's a volume control.
That's correct.
And the volume control could either go at a normal level, or if you turn it up, it'll amplify the voice.
Exactly.
I see. Because there are many hard of hearing who can hear with the amplification. Now, could you tell us a little about how the hard of hearing or the person using a TDD would communicate with the Merrill Lynch broker? How are we going to set that up?
Every one of my Merrill Lynch brokers in the network has his own TDD and spatial amplifier. And every one of my FCs has a direct line. It does not have to, the deaf client does not have to go through the switchboard. He can call his financial consultant directly on a special TDD number. And the FC will merely answer as soon as the phone rings, and he just breaks the phone into cups and introduce himself, and then GI. And then they just carry on a normal conversation as he would with a hearing person.
I see. So the telephone is really like a modem, the same kind of modem that you have in a computer.
So you can look at it that way, yes. Yeah. But it's basically a very simple device, like two typewriters talking back to each other.
If someone were to telephone in, there's an option here. For a hard of hearing person, the Merrill Lynch broker could talk into the phone and carry on that conversation.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, if it's a non-hearing person, then he would take the telephone, put it on the modem, and the TDD is now operating.
Exactly.
That's the system.
Yes.
I see.
Merrill Lynch is the first company in Wall Street to recognize the communication needs of the deaf people. So far, we have 70 financial consultants in our network representing 38 states. And my hope for this year is to have every state covered or represented by a financial consultant equipped with a similar device, a TDD and spatial amplifiers.
Now, my assumption, Chris, is that we're going to put an 800 number on the screen now. That's going to come up. Why don't we do that? Why don't we get the 800 numbers on here? The first 800 number is 1-800-765-4...
TDD.
4833? Is that it, 4833?
That's correct.
Or 765 TDD. Now that 800 number would be for the non-hearing person.
That's correct.
And that person would use the TDD. Now we have a second 800 number coming up, and that is 1-800-765-4HOH.
That's right.
for hard of hearing. And that one, the person calling in all likelihood, would use the conventional telephone with the power
Right.
amplification.
All those two numbers go directly to a communication center in New Jersey. And then those prospects are referred to the nearest financial consultant in my network who are equipped with those two particular devices.
Let's very briefly bring both 800 numbers on for just a moment, and then we'll come back, put the picture back on Chris. The first 800 number was, see if, there it is. The first 800 number for the TDD is 1-800-765-4833. The second 800 number is for the hard of hearing, 1-800-765-4HOH. Now let's come back to our show, and we'll take the 800 numbers off the screen so that you can see Chris and myself on the show. Chris, how did Merrill Lynch do this now? Did we set up a special service with the telephone company where these calls come in and are funneled around?
No, the only thing that we had to set up was a special 800 line. The rest was up to us to set up the equipment. We have a special computer equipment that works like a TDD, and we can take in 4 or 5 calls simultaneously if necessary.
And then in turn, if a person calls in from Louisiana and you have a broker in New Orleans, you would refer him down there.
Exactly.
Or if it's a person in New England states, you would refer to a broker in one of the
Exactly.
New England offices.
Yes.
So in effect, we're servicing the entire nation.
That's
We have a
definitely
nationwide network. That's very interesting. Could you tell us a little about the hearing impaired or the hard of hearing person as an investor? They are ordinary people. They're people like you and I. They have the same instincts. Is there any distinguishing characteristics about them that you know of in
Yes,
past history?
Yes, the variety is very broad. We have deaf people who became deaf in the 20s and 30s and 40s. They're really called the late deaf adults. We also have people who are oralists, meaning deaf people who are prelingually deaf, meaning deaf before birth, postlingually deaf, meaning deaf after birth. The oralist group are usually more educated because they are mainstream into our educational system.
Well, now you're an oralist.
As I've been an oralist all my life.
And an oralist is a deaf person who has been taught to speak.
That's correct, yes. And we have deaf people who are bilingual, meaning having the capability of knowing sign and speech at the same time. And of course, we mentioned before that we have the Asian deaf, people who become deaf in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So to have all these different groups with different perspective.
Yeah, I'm interested
are.
particularly in the oralists, the people who were deaf either before birth or before school. Now, their patterns as consumers, in some way, they're handicapped as a consumer because of, in the past, an inability to communicate. Do you find that they tend to be very conservative as investors? Do they tend to buy common stock, or do they tend to buy mutual funds, or are there any patterns
A
that are
large
discernible?
majority of deaf people are very, very conservative.
They
by
are.
nature, yes. Because of the fact that they're not, should I say, well acquainted or well familiar with all the financial information that goes on around them. So they tend to be extra cautious, extra careful as to where the money should be placed. This goes back to the inherent skepticism that I have developed over the last 50, 60 years.
However, Chris, when you think of investing in the United States, I feel that on the investment scene, so increasingly now the deaf or the non-hearing person has the same opportunities as the hearing person. I guess the real drawback was the inability to communicate with a professional investment advisor.
Yes, yes. That's precisely why this 800 number was set up, is to allow the deaf people an opportunity to enhance their understanding of the investment world. And Merrill Lynch really has put themselves in a position where we are able to educate a large number of deaf people on the value of long-term investment and so forth.
How do you, I've worked as a financial consultant for 30 years now, as you know, and one of my important rules of operating, before I take a client on, I like to meet them. Gives me a chance to see what they're like and gives them a chance to see what I'm like. And if either one of us want to reject the other, we can do it. We can do it rather quickly. How do you see the introduction coming about here? Essentially, this is very impersonal if the introduction is essentially through a machine.
The impersonal?
Impersonal, yes.
Not really. I never found it that way, being impersonal. I think this is just as personal as if two people were communicating with each other verbally. Really.
I see. Because you've been used to it and you've used it down through the years.
Sure. But there's one other thing that I'd like to add about this particular technology. Congress just passed a bill for the Americans with Disability Act.
Yes.
And it was just signed by President Bush a few weeks ago. And that bill is extremely important for not only for the deaf people, but for the disabled population at large.
Okay. We're at the end of our program, Chris.
Okay.
I wonder, could we get those 2-800 numbers on there briefly again? 1-800-765-4833 for the people who need a TDY, the total non-hearing population. 1-800-765-4HOH for the people who have are hard of hearing. We want to reach out to that community. We want to bring them investment service, better investment advice, make them more affluent, to enjoy more leisure in the community. Chris, thank you for being with me. I really enjoyed being with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.